What would you do if the person you loved was the one you could never have? Would you walk away to protect your heart or stay, knowing it might destroy everything you've built? This is the story of Emily Carter, a brilliant executive assistant who spent years hiding her feelings for her boss. Jonathan Hale, a self-made millionaire with everything except peace. In the high-rise world of Denver finance, ambition was currency, and emotion was weakness. But when Emily typed her resignation letter, planning to leave before her love became a scandal, Jonathan did something no one expected. He tore the letter apart and confessed the truth he'd buried for years. What happens when love crosses professional lines, when integrity collides with desire, and two hearts must choose between duty and honesty? Can love survive the judgment of the world, or will it demand too great a price? Stay with us as we unfold a journey of courage, redemption, and quiet triumph. If you believe that love can still change lives even in the hardest places, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And let's begin. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound left in the office. Outside the glass walls, Denver's skyline glowed beneath the fading sunset, that amber hour when the city looked softer, almost forgiving. Emily Carter sat at her desk, perfectly still, her hands folded over a single white envelope. The words she had typed only an hour ago still seemed to vibrate in her mind. Resignation letter, her name, her signature, the date, everything in its proper place, just like the rest of her life. And yet, nothing about it felt right. She had written hundreds of letters for other people memos, contracts, executive proposals, but never one that had cost her so much. This one felt like a confession, a goodbye, not just to a job, but to a man she could never have. She took off her glasses and rubbed her temples. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixed with the sterile scent of polished glass and paperwork. Around her, the office was nearly empty now. The junior associates had long gone home. Only a few desk lamps still glowed tiny islands of light in a sea of dusk. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, shoulders straight, hair neat, expression composed. Only the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed the storm inside. She whispered to herself, "You're doing the right thing. Emily, you have to." Her voice sounded too calm, too practiced, like a line from a script she'd repeated too many times. She wished it felt true. It had started so simply. 3 years ago, she had joined Hale Financial Group, a fast-growing investment firm known for its brilliance and brutal efficiency. Jonathan Hale, the CEO, was a legend in Denver's business circles, self-made, charismatic, always the first to arrive, the last to leave. He'd hired her personally after a single interview. "You're precise," he had said, "and you listen between the lines." She remembered the way he'd looked at her, not flirtatious, not intrusive, just interested, as if he saw something in her that others overlooked. Back then, she had admired him like everyone else, admired his focus, his certainty, his discipline. But admiration is a dangerous thing when it lingers too long. It becomes attachment, and then, quietly, it becomes something else. Love had crept up on her like fatigue after a long day, slow, inevitable, uninvited. She had fought it for months. She had tried to remind herself that he was her boss, that there were rules, that professionalism mattered. But the rules didn't stop her heart from racing each time he passed her desk. The rules didn't silence the warmth in her chest when he smiled at her, or the ache when he left for meetings out of town. Now, sitting in the stillness of that late evening, she felt the full weight of what her decision meant. Leaving meant freedom, yes, but it also meant loss. It meant no more morning coffee waiting on his desk, no more late-night projects that turned into quiet conversations about everything but work. No more moments when his voice softened, when his eyes lingered just a little too long. It meant pretending that none of it had ever mattered. She pushed the letter slightly forward, as if to distance herself from it. The sound of paper against wood was sharp in the silence. a sharp sound for a clean break. Clean breaks don't hurt this much, she murmured. Her phone buzzed. A calendar reminder, Jonathan Hale, weekly strategy recap, 6:30 p.m. She exhaled. Of course. The meeting she'd been dreading all day. It was supposed to be routine numbers, projections, client updates, but now it felt like a goodbye she couldn't say out loud. For a moment, she considered skipping it. She could just leave the letter on his desk and walk away. No explanations, no tears, just vanish into the night, the way people do when they can't bear to look back. But that wasn't her. Emily Carter did not run. She faced things gracefully, quietly, even when it broke her. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and took one last look around her office. The framed photo of the mountains, the cactus she could never remember to water, the stack of client files labeled in her careful handwriting. All tiny pieces of a life that had been hers until now. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the elevator. With every step, her heart protested. With every step, her mind reminded her why she had to go. Because love between a boss and his assistant wasn't just frowned upon, it could ruin them both. And she respected him too much to be the reason he lost everything he'd built. The elevator doors opened, reflecting her face again, composed, unreadable. She stepped inside, the envelope pressed to her chest like a secret. When the doors slid shut, the sound felt final. For a second, her vision blurred. She blinked rapidly and forced herself to breathe. "You'll be fine," she told herself. "You've survived worse. You'll survive this too." But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Because this wasn't about survival, it was about surrender. And surrender, she realized, was harder than any war. As the elevator descended toward the top executive floor, her reflection wavered in the metal doors, two Emilys overlapping. The one who stayed strong for everyone else, and the one who was falling apart quietly inside. When the doors opened again, the corridor was empty. Jonathan's office stood at the end, its glass walls glowing softly with the city lights. He was still there. Of course, he was always there. Emily took one more breath, slipped the envelope into her hand, and walked toward him. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, steady but heavy, each one a heartbeat, closer to the moment that would change everything. The Denver skyline shimmered behind him, a constellation of golden lights. He looked up as she entered. Their eyes met across the glass, and time seemed to pause. For a brief, fleeting instant. She wished she could stop right there between staying and leaving, between love and duty, in that fragile place where everything still felt possible. But the letter in her hand reminded her it was already too late. Jonathan Hale's office sat like a glass observatory above downtown Denver, 3 walls of tempered light looking out on the Rockies, and one wall made of memory. Most evenings he stayed long after the staff had gone, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled, the glow of the skyline reflecting off the polished floor. From that height, the city looked almost peaceful. From that height, no one could see how lonely success could be. At 42, Jonathan Hale was the kind of man newspapers like to call self-made, son of a mechanic, graduate of a small state college. He had turned a modest startup into Hale Financial Group, a national powerhouse managing billions in investments. People admired him, feared him, envied him, but few truly knew him. Behind the sharp suits and precise numbers lived a man who measured life in quarterly reports, who had taught himself that vulnerability was a liability. Every decision he made was calculated, deliberate, safe. Until Emily Carter arrived, he still remembered their first interview 3 years earlier. She had walked in wearing a navy blazer, her resume neat but unpretentious. When he asked why she wanted to work for a company known for its intensity, she met his gaze without flinching. "Because I believe excellence shouldn't be intimidating," she'd said. He'd smiled something rare for him in interviews and hired her on the spot. He told himself it was her professionalism, her organization, her sharp eye for detail. But later, he realized there had been something else, a quiet steadiness he couldn't quite name. The first year passed in a blur of 12-hour days and weekend strategy sessions. Emily became his right hand, the person who anticipated problems before they happened, who brought black coffee just when he needed it most. When clients praised his precision, he knew half the credit belonged to her. He admired her calm, the way she handled the sharp edges of the corporate world without losing her gentleness. When tempers flared in meetings, she diffused them with a few thoughtful words. When deadlines loomed, she stayed late without complaint, her handwriting even, and beautiful across the minutes she prepared for him. Sometimes, when the office emptied and silence settled in, he would glance across the glass wall separating their desks. She would be there, hair pulled back, tapping quietly at her keyboard, unaware that he was watching. There was something reassuring about her presence, steady, human, real. He had learned long ago that admiration could become attachment if you weren't careful. So, he built invisible walls, polite, professional, necessary. But feelings have a way of slipping through glass. One night in early spring, a blizzard had trapped them both in the building. The staff had left hours earlier, snow piling against the lobby doors. Emily had brought him a mug of hot cocoa from the break room the last packet left. They'd sat by the window, watching the flakes whirl through the city lights. "You should go home early tomorrow," he had said, his tone softer than he meant it to be. "You too," she'd replied. "The company can survive one day without you." He'd chuckled low, genuine, surprised by the sound. For a moment, the line between boss and assistant blurred into something warmer, more human. When the storm finally eased, he offered to drive her home. She declined politely, choosing to wait for the streets to clear. He respected that her independence, her boundaries. Yet, when he watched her walk toward the elevator, he felt a quiet tug in his chest, a wordless wish to follow. Over the next months, that pull grew stronger. He began noticing details he had no right to notice: the small silver bracelet she always wore, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the faint laugh that escaped her when a project finally balanced to perfection. He told himself it was harmless, just admiration for competence. But late at night, when the office was dark and the city below shimmered like broken glass, he caught himself replaying those small moments. He wondered what her life was like beyond these walls. Was there someone waiting for her? Did she smile differently outside this place, freer, lighter? He never asked. He couldn't. Boundaries were what kept everything in order, and order was what had built his empire. Still, every time their eyes met across a meeting table, he felt the thin glass of his composure crack just a little more. Jonathan had seen too many men in power destroy themselves over emotion. His mentor once told him, "Empires fall not from failure, but from distraction." He believed that for years. But lately, he had started to question it. If success meant living behind walls so thick that no one could touch you, was that really success? He remembered one Friday evening when Emily had come to deliver a quarterly report. She'd stayed to help him finish a presentation due Monday. It was nearly midnight when she noticed his exhaustion and gently said, "You don't have to prove anything tonight. Jonathan, you already did." The words startled him, not because of what she said, but because of the quiet concern behind them. He realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to him that way, with care, not calculation. When she left that night, he stood at the window long after, watching the reflection of the elevator lights fade. He told himself to forget the sound of her voice. He failed. Now. As he looked out over the city, he tried to focus on the steady hum of success, the numbers, the meetings, the controlled rhythm of his days. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he sensed that change was coming. He had noticed her distance lately, the way she avoided his gaze, the new reserve in her tone. Something was different. He told himself it was just stress, end-of-quarter fatigue. But a deeper part of him, the one that had learned to read markets and people alike, knew better. She was slipping away, and for the first time in years, he felt fear. He turned from the window, glanced at the clock. 6:20 p.m. Emily would be arriving soon for their strategy recap. He straightened his tie, trying to ignore the sudden tightness in his chest. When the elevator chimed and her footsteps echoed down the corridor, he felt the strange, unwelcome rush of adrenaline that came whenever she entered a room. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Behind his calm expression, behind the immaculate glass walls, Jonathan Hale prepared for a meeting that would quietly change both of their lives. The following morning, Denver was drenched in soft gray light. Clouds hung low over the mountains, the kind that made the city look muted, like someone had dimmed the brightness of the whole world. Emily Carter arrived early, as she always did. The office was still half asleep. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the break room. The hum of the copy machine was steady, familiar. It should have felt ordinary, comforting even, but today, everything looked different. She stood by her desk, coffee in hand, gazing at the neat rows of folders, the monitor, the framed photo of her parents from Vermont. This small square of space had been hers for 3 years, her island of order amid the storm of deadlines and deals. And now, she was preparing to let it go. She set the coffee down and pulled open her drawers. Pens, sticky notes, a small jar of paper clips. Each object seemed to hum with memory. The blue pen Jonathan had borrowed and never returned. The notepad where she'd once jotted a reminder to call a client, only to find his handwritten thank you on the same page later that day. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides behind a sigh. 3 years, she whispered. You'd think it'd be easier to pack up a few things. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet, fragile, unfamiliar. Around 9, the office began to fill with the usual sounds, heels clicking, keyboards tapping, phones ringing. Emily tucked the envelope, the same white resignation letter, beneath a folder on her desk. She wasn't ready to hand it in yet, not while her hands were still trembling. Morning, a voice called softly. She turned to see Mark Benson, one of the senior analysts, standing by the coffee station. Mark was the kind of coworker who noticed things. Not the gossip kind, just observant. He'd always had a quiet respect for her, the sort that never needed words. You're here early. Again, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You and Hale competing for who opens the building first. She laughed, though the sound came out thin. Old habits die hard. He studied her for a moment. You look tired. Everything okay? She hesitated. There were so many possible answers. I'm fine. I'm just busy. It's nothing. But what came out was softer. I'm just making some changes. Mark tilted his head. Changes. Emily gestured vaguely at her desk. I've been thinking it might be time for something new. Maybe a slower pace. He frowned, crossing his arms. You're serious. You're Hale's right hand. You leaving would be like unplugging the whole system. Systems adapt, she said quietly. He chuckled, shaking his head. Well, you've earned the right to do whatever you want. But if you ask me, he'll lose more than an assistant. She froze for half a second, then forced a smile. He'll be fine. Mark studied her again, too perceptive for comfort, then nodded slowly. If you say so. He turned back to his coffee, but his voice lingered. For what it's worth. Sometimes people don't realize what they need until it's gone. His words followed her like a shadow for the rest of the morning. By noon, her office looked almost bare. The framed photo was wrapped in paper. The cactus was tucked into a small cardboard box. She wiped the surface of her desk until it gleamed. Her heart thudded softly as she looked around. It felt like closing a chapter she hadn't finished reading. She sank into her chair and stared out the window. The city was alive and restless, unaware that somewhere inside one of its towers, a woman was quietly breaking her own heart. Her thoughts drifted back to all the late nights, the laughter over takeout containers, the quiet exchange of ideas, the way Jonathan's voice softened when he said her name. She had kept those moments locked away like fragile glass, never meant to be touched. But now, as she prepared to leave, the memories slipped through her fingers like sand. At 1:15, she received an email from Jonathan's office. Weekly recap rescheduled for 5:30 p.m. Of course. He always noticed when she tried to avoid him. always found a way to make her stay a little longer. Her pulse quickened. The letter felt heavier than paper should. She pressed her hand over it, whispering almost like a prayer. Do the right thing. Emily, sometimes leaving is the only way to stay whole. The phrase came from her mother, something she'd said when Emily left Vermont at 25 to start a career in Denver. Her mother had hugged her tight, whispering that very line. Back then, it meant chasing ambition. Now, it meant letting go before love turned into ruin. By late afternoon, clouds thickened over the city. The office lights flickered against the darkening glass. Emily placed her packed box by the door and checked her reflection in the window. Straight posture, calm eyes, professional smile, the performance of composure. As she locked her drawer, her phone buzzed again. A message from Mark Dinner after work. To celebrate your new chapter. Whatever it is, she typed back, maybe another time. She didn't have the heart for celebrations. Not tonight. Her focus drifted toward Jonathan's office across the hall. Through the glass, she could see his silhouette head bent over his laptop, motionless except for the rise and fall of his shoulders. He looked exhausted. He always did when the markets were volatile or when deadlines loomed. But tonight, there was something else in his posture, something that looked almost lost. She turned away quickly before the ache could grow sharper. At 5:20, she gathered her courage, sliding the envelope into her folder. Her hands were steady now. Her heart was not. She took one last look around her office, every corner neat, every memory sealed away. Then she whispered to herself, this is it. Endings are just another kind of honesty. And with that, she picked up the envelope and stepped into the hallway. Her heels echoed softly as she approached his door. Each sound carried the rhythm of finality, like a heartbeat slowing, preparing to rest. For 3 years, she had walked this corridor hundreds of times, but tonight, it felt different. Every step felt like walking away from the person she might have been, the one who believed she could love him quietly and survive. The golden light from his office spilled into the hallway, warm and inviting. She paused for just a second, steadying her breath, willing her heart to stay calm. Then she knocked. Jonathan looked up from his desk, startled, then relieved. "Emily," he said, his voice low, gentle, "come in." And just like that, her decision met its reckoning. The moment Emily stepped through Jonathan's glass door, the air felt different, thicker somehow, charged with everything unsaid. He was standing near the window, Denver's skyline glowing behind him like a wall of light. His jacket hung on the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled, a few strands of hair falling loose across his forehead. He looked less like the untouchable CEO everyone admired, and more like a man who had been running too hard for too long. "Emily," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're early," she nodded, clutching the folder to her chest. "I thought we could go over the strategy revisions before your call with the board tomorrow." He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Of course. Sit down." Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she crossed the room. Every sound seemed louder than usual, the hum of the city outside, the ticking of the clock, the soft scrape of paper as she set the folder down. Jonathan watched her, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "You look tense," he said quietly. She forced a polite smile. "Just a long day. Or something more." His tone was gentle, but his gaze was direct. He had always been able to read her too easily. She looked down at her hands, then at the folder. The envelope inside it felt like a living thing pressing against her palm, begging to be released. "Jonathan," she began, her voice catching on his name, "there's something I need to give you." He frowned slightly. "All right." She reached into the folder and pulled out the envelope. For a moment, she stared at it, the clean white paper glowing against the dark wood of his desk. Then she slid it toward him. His eyes dropped to the envelope, then back to her. "What's this? My resignation." The words landed between them like glass shattering in slow motion. He didn't move, didn't speak, only stared at her, as if trying to process the sound. Finally, he reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a current up her arm, and she withdrew her hand too quickly. He turned the envelope over once, twice, as though buying time. Then, without opening it, he asked why Emily had rehearsed her answer all day. She had planned to speak clearly, calmly, professionally, but now, standing in front of him, every prepared word dissolved. "I just think it's time," she said softly. "I've learned everything I can here. I need a change." He studied her face. "That's not the truth." Her breath hitched. "It's what I've decided." He set the envelope down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk. His voice was calm, but something darker flickered beneath it. "You've never been a coward, Emily, so don't start now. What's really going on?" She looked away, toward the window. The lights of the city blurred into gold streaks through the glass. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "Do what? Work here. Pretend that nothing's changed when everything has." There was a pause, heavy and electric. Jonathan's voice softened, changed how she turned back to him. And for the first time, the mask slipped. "You know exactly how?" He took a slow step toward her. The distance between them shrank until she could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint trace of cedar from his cologne. "I want to hear you say it," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "Don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not the one making it hard." Their eyes met steady, unblinking. The air between them felt fragile, breakable, alive. Finally, Jonathan exhaled, a sound more like surrender than relief. He picked up the envelope, studied it for a moment, then set it back down. "No," he said simply. Emily frowned. "No, I'm not accepting this." "Jonathan, this isn't your decision." "Yes, it is." He interrupted, his voice rising, then softening again. "At least until I say what I should have said months ago." He moved around the desk slowly, deliberately, stopping just in front of her. When he spoke again, his tone was stripped of authority, raw, human. "I can't let you go. Emily, not because you're irreplaceable at work, but because I'm in love with you." The world seemed to stop. The city outside vanished. The hum of the air conditioner, the clock, the noise of her heartbeat, all of it disappeared. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He continued, his voice trembling just slightly. "I've tried to ignore it. I've buried myself in work, convinced myself that what I felt was admiration, gratitude, habit, but it isn't. It's love. Simple, impossible, inconvenient love. Jonathan." He shook his head, almost pleading. "You don't have to say anything. Just don't walk out that door believing you mean nothing to me." Emily felt tears sting the back of her eyes. "You can't say things like that," she whispered. "You're my boss." "Not right now," he said softly. "Right now. I'm just a man telling the truth." The words hit her like a slow, gentle tide, beautiful, terrifying, unstoppable. She stepped back, needing space, needing air. "Do you have any idea what this could do to both of us? The company, your reputation? Mine, I don't care about that. You should. I've cared about everything else my whole life. Emily, maybe it's time I care about something real." Silence filled the room again, thick, heavy, alive with everything they weren't supposed to feel. Her tears threatened to fall, but she blinked them away. "This isn't fair," she said. "You can't just decide this for both of us." "I'm not deciding," he said gently. "I'm confessing." He reached for her hand, but stopped halfway, his fingers curling into his palm. The gesture hesitant, restrained, was somehow more intimate than a touch. "You can walk out of here and never look back," he said. "But if you stay, if there's even a part of you that feels what I feel, then we'll find a way, carefully, honestly, together." Her breath came shallow, uneven. "You don't know what you're asking." He smiled sadly. "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you not to lie to yourself the way I've been lying to mine." For a moment, Neither of them moved. The office seemed to shrink until it was just two people, one heartbeat. Then Emily turned away, pressing a hand to her chest. "I need time. Take it," he said softly, "but don't take your resignation." She looked back at him, torn between fear and something dangerously close to hope. The envelope lay untouched between them, white and clean and meaningless now. When she finally left his office, the hallway lights flickered on as motion sensors caught her steps. She walked slowly, as if through water, the weight of his words echoing with every breath. "Not because you're irreplaceable at work, but because I'm in love with you." She had wanted clarity. Instead, she'd found the one truth that made everything harder. The night felt endless. After she left Jonathan's office, Emily didn't go straight home. She drove without direction through the quiet streets of Denver, headlights reflecting off wet asphalt. The city was wrapped in that thin blue haze that always followed a late rain. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but her mind was somewhere else still in that glass-walled office, replaying every word, every breath. "I can't let you go. Emily, not because you're irreplaceable at work, but because I'm in love with you." She pulled over near a small park, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the sound of distant traffic fade into a dull hum. Her heart beat too fast, too loud. It would have been easier if he hadn't said those words, if she could have left thinking he didn't care, but now everything was tangled: her job, her integrity, her sense of self. Love was never supposed to feel like a conflict of interest. When she finally reached her apartment, it was nearly midnight. The living room was dim, filled only with the glow of the city through the curtains. She poured herself a glass of water and sank into the couch. Her phone buzzed once: a message from Jonathan. "Please let me know you got home safely." She stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm fine. We'll talk tomorrow." Her thumb hovered over send. Then she deleted the message. It was safer not to reply. Sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts circling like restless birds. She could still see the look on his face, so vulnerable, so unlike the man she worked for every day. That look had cracked something inside her, a wall she'd spent years building. She turned onto her side, clutching the pillow. Part of her wanted to believe that what he said could be true. That love could be honest, even here, even between them. But another part, older, sharper, whispered of consequences. "You know better." Emily. The voice wasn't her own. It was her father's. She could still picture him, a high school teacher with kind eyes and a stubborn sense of right and wrong. He used to say, "Integrity is what you keep when the world isn't watching." She'd lived by that her whole life. If she stayed, people would talk. If she left, her heart would break. Either way, she would lose something she valued deeply, her peace or her principles. The next morning, she arrived at the office early again. Her reflection in the elevator door looked pale, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. The elevator chimed, and she stepped out into the empty corridor. Jonathan's office light was already on. She hesitated outside his door, debating whether to walk in. But before she could knock, it opened. He stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," he said softly. She blinked, startled. "You're here early. So are you." He offered her a cup. Peace offering. She hesitated, then accepted it. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, 2 people suspended between routine and something that felt dangerously new. Finally, Jonathan stepped aside. "Come in, please." His office looked the same as always, orderly, minimal, controlled. But now, every detail felt different. Every glance between them carried the weight of what had been said the night before. Emily set the coffee on his desk and took a breath. "We can't pretend that didn't happen." "I'm not pretending," he said. "I meant every word." She shook her head, trying to steady her voice. "Jonathan, this is wrong. You know that." "Wrong," he repeated softly. "To tell the truth, wrong because it crosses a line. she said firmly. There are policies, ethics, expectations. If people found out, they'd assume the worst. He finished for her. I know. Then why say it? She asked. Why make this harder? He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, because living a lie was harder. The honesty in his tone unsettled her. It stripped away the power dynamic, leaving only two hearts trying to speak the same language. Do you think I wanted this? He continued. Do you think I planned any of it? I fought it. Emily, every day. But seeing you walk in with that resignation letter, he paused, shaking his head. It felt like losing something I hadn't even admitted I had. Her throat tightened. You don't get to do this, she whispered. You don't get to say that and expect me to, just to what he interrupted gently. Deny what's real. Protect what's right, she said. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. He moved to the window, running a hand through his hair. You think I don't care about what's right? I've built this company from nothing. I've sacrificed friendships, time, even happiness. But somewhere along the way, I started to wonder if right and good were always the same thing. She watched him silently, torn between admiration and fear. He turned back to her. Tell me honestly, if you weren't afraid of what people would think, would you still walk away? Her answer came quickly, instinctively. Yes. Then, after a long pause, she added quietly, because I don't trust myself not to love you back. Jonathan's expression softened, his voice barely a whisper. Then you already do. The words made her chest ache. Don't, she said, shaking her head. Please don't make this something it can't be. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady. Then let's make it what it can be. Let's do it right. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean we don't hide it. We go to HR. We tell them the truth. We follow every protocol. If it means you work under someone else, fine. If it means I step back, fine. But we face it, together. His conviction startled her. You'd risk that, she asked softly. Your reputation, the board, the investors. He smiled faintly. I've risked more for less. Silence stretched between them, again, fragile, uncertain, but no longer afraid. Finally, Emily exhaled, her shoulders loosening. All right, she said. We'll talk to HR, but not because I think this will work, because I need to know I didn't just run away. Jonathan nodded slowly, relief flickering across his face. That's all I ask. As she turned to leave his office, Emily caught her reflection in the glass, calm, composed, but no longer hollow. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't running from the truth. She was walking toward it. The meeting with human resources lasted less than an hour, but it changed everything. The HR director, Janet Russell, was calm and methodical, a woman who had seen every type of corporate scandal and still managed to keep her lipstick perfectly intact. She listened without judgment as Jonathan and Emily sat across from her, side by side, explaining their situation. Jonathan's voice was measured, steady. We've developed personal feelings for each other, he said. We wanted to be transparent and handle this according to policy. Janet nodded, taking notes with neat, deliberate strokes. I appreciate your honesty. Given your positions, there will need to be adjustments. She explained the options. Emily would transfer to another department, investor relations, reporting to a different executive. Her salary and title would remain the same, but she would no longer report directly to Jonathan. They would also need to sign official documentation, acknowledging the relationship and agreeing to maintain professionalism in the workplace. The words documentation and acknowledging made everything sound so clinical, so cold, like they were confessing to a crime instead of admitting to love. Still, Emily signed, so did Jonathan. When they left Janet's office, the hallway felt brighter than usual, almost blinding. Emily exhaled slowly. It's done, she said. Jonathan turned to her, his expression unreadable. It's only just beginning. By lunchtime, the whispers had started. It began as a ripple, small, curious glances in the hallway. half-finished sentences that ended when she entered the break room. By 3 o'clock, it was a wave. Someone had forwarded a confidential memo from HR to the wrong person. And within an hour, the entire building knew. Emily could feel it in the way people looked at her. Not directly, never directly, but in those quick, sidelong glances that carried judgment sharper than words. When she passed a group of analysts in the hallway, the conversation paused. When she entered the break room, the laughter softened. She told herself to ignore it. She had done nothing wrong. They had followed every rule, every policy. But guilt doesn't need to be earned to be felt. It only needs to be implied. At 4:15, she found an anonymous note on her desk. It was typed, short, and cruel. You slept your way up. No signature, no clue who sent it. She stared at it for a long moment, her hands trembling. Then she folded the note once, twice, and dropped it into the trash. But she couldn't throw away the sting of it. Her computer screen blurred. She blinked, forcing back tears, refusing to give whoever wrote it the satisfaction. Her phone buzzed a message from the Jonathan. Board meeting at 5. They want to discuss us. Don't worry, I'll handle it. She stared at the text. Don't worry. 2 simple words that carried the impossible promise that everything would be fine. But deep down, she knew the storm was only gaining strength. When she walked out that evening, Denver's sky had turned a heavy gray. Wind swept through the glass atrium, as if echoing the unease inside the building. At the elevator, Mark Benson caught up to her. Emily, he said gently, you okay? She forced a small smile. Fine. He hesitated, lowering his voice. People are talking. It's ugly. I know. I told them to knock it off, he said. But you know how offices are once gossip starts. It feeds itself. She nodded. Thanks. Mark, but you don't have to protect me. I'm not, he said quietly. I've worked here 10 years. I've seen them build people up and tear them down. Don't let them get to you. She managed a small nod. I won't. But as she stepped into the elevator, she wasn't sure she believed it. That same hour, on the top floor, Jonathan Hale sat at the head of the long mahogany table in the boardroom. 7 members of the Hale Financial Board of Directors watched him with a mixture of disappointment and concern. The chairman, Edward Langford, cleared his throat. Jonathan, we received word of your disclosure to HR. I assume you understand the implications I do, Jonathan said evenly. This company prides itself on professionalism. Langford continued. Romantic involvement with subordinates, even disclosed, can raise questions about judgment. Jonathan kept his tone calm. Emily is no longer my subordinate. We've followed every regulation. Another board member, Patricia Miles, leaned forward. Perception matters more than paperwork. Jonathan, the media, the investors. If this gets out, it could affect our credibility. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Our credibility is built on performance, not gossip. The company's numbers speak for themselves. Langford steepled his fingers. Be that as it may. We need reassurance that this will not interfere with your leadership. Jonathan's reply was quiet, but firm. It won't. The chairman studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I hope you're right, for all our sakes. Meanwhile, down on the 22nd floor, Emily was finishing her transfer paperwork. The HR assistant smiled politely, but didn't meet her eyes. It was the same polite avoidance she'd been getting all day, the subtle distance people create when they don't want to be seen taking sides. By the time she left the building, the office chatter had reached full storm. Someone had even edited a photo of her and Jonathan from last year's charity gala, circulating it through private messages with cruel captions. She didn't confront anyone. She just walked faster, her heels echoing against the marble lobby, the sound sharp enough to drown out the murmurs. Outside, the evening air was cool, the first flakes of snow swirling down. She tilted her face upward and let one land on her cheek. It melted instantly, disappearing like proof that it had ever existed. She whispered to herself, You did the right thing. You were honest. But honesty. She was learning. didn't always come with peace. Across town, Jonathan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the Denver skyline. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the board members. This situation is becoming a distraction. Fix it before the market does. He closed his eyes and leaned back, exhaustion creeping into his bones. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. The world outside saw a scandal. He saw a woman worth fighting for. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared out at the night. The snow was falling harder now, soft and relentless. Somewhere in another part of the city, Emily was probably watching the same snowfall, trying to find calm in the storm he had dragged her into. He whispered to the empty room, "Hold on. Emily, we'll get through this." But the wind against the windows gave no answer, only the sound of the storm, closing in from every side. The next morning dawned cold and unnervingly bright, as if the city had chosen irony for its weather. Denver's skyline sparkled under a thin coat of snow. But inside Hale Financial Group, the atmosphere was anything but pure. Jonathan Hale stood at the head of the boardroom table, 12 feet of polished oak, surrounded by 12 people who had built their fortunes betting on his judgment. Today, that judgment was on trial. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Behind Jonathan, floor-to-ceiling windows stretched open to the city, a reminder of everything he'd built. In front of him sat the board members, sharp suits, sharper eyes. Edward Langford, the chairman, tapped his pen against his notepad. "Jonathan," he began, his tone clipped and rehearsed. "We're here because your personal decisions are threatening the company's stability." Jonathan didn't flinch. "With respect, Edward, the company's stability is stronger than it's ever been. Revenue is up 20% this quarter." Langford leaned back. "Revenue isn't the issue. Reputation is." Across the table, Patricia Miles adjusted her glasses. "We've received calls from 2 major clients. They want reassurance that their assets are being managed by people who prioritize professionalism over passion." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "So, because I'm in a relationship with someone who works here, disclosed and approved, mind you, you think I've lost the ability to lead?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "It's not about ability, it's about perception. And perception moves markets." The sentence landed like a gavel. Jonathan's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table. He'd spent 15 years building Hale Financial into a fortress of integrity. Every decision had been weighed, calculated, responsible, and now, because of a single honest confession, they were questioning everything. He scanned the faces around the table, men and women who had once praised him for his precision, his restraint, his lack of sentiment. They admired him most when he felt nothing, but he was done pretending he didn't feel. "Emily Carter," he began, voice steady, "is one of the most capable professionals I've ever worked with. She has integrity, intelligence, and a work ethic that puts most of us to shame. The success of 3 of our major accounts this year is due to her strategic insight, not mine." Langford raised an eyebrow. "You're asking us to believe this is purely professional." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Jonathan replied evenly. "I'm telling you the truth. Our relationship is personal, yes, but it doesn't compromise this company. I've ensured that through HR protocols. She's been transferred. There is no conflict of interest." A murmur rippled through the room. At the far end of the table, Eleanor Pierce, the oldest member of the board, adjusted her scarf. She had been with the company since its founding. Silver hair, thoughtful eyes, and a calm presence that could silence a room without a word. "Jonathan," she said softly, "no one questions your brilliance or your devotion to this firm, but you must see how this looks. The world is quick to judge, especially when power and affection intersect." He met her gaze. "I do see it. But should I make decisions based on gossip or on what's right?" Eleanor tilted her head. "And what's right, in your view?" He hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "To be honest, to stop living as if feelings are flaws, to show that leadership doesn't require sacrificing our humanity." A silence followed, long, contemplative. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a small, wistful smile tugging at her lips. "You remind me," she said, "of someone I once knew." Patricia frowned. "Eleanor." She ignored the interruption. "When I was your age, Jonathan, I was offered a partnership at a firm in New York. I turned it down because I fell in love with a colleague. Everyone told me I'd ruin my career. But you know what?" Her smile deepened. "I built a better one here. Integrity isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about caring and staying accountable." Jonathan felt something shift in the room. The sharpness dulled. Even Patricia's posture softened slightly. Langford sighed. "You're asking us to take a risk. I'm asking you," Jonathan said, "to remember who we are. This company was founded on merit, transparency, and courage. We can't preach integrity to clients if we punish it internally." The discussion dragged on for another hour. Numbers, policies, damage control. Jonathan answered every question calmly, logically, but beneath his composure ran a current of steel. At one point, Langford leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Tell me honestly if this relationship becomes a liability. Will you end it for the sake of the company?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "No." A murmur broke out, sharp and immediate. Langford's pen froze mid-air. "Excuse me," Jonathan repeated, slower this time. "No, I won't end it." Patricia's voice rose. "You'd risk 15 years of work, your reputation, your position for one relationship." He straightened, meeting her gaze. "For the right one? Yes." The words hung heavy, echoing against the glass walls. Eleanor smiled faintly, murmuring, "Then I suppose we've all had our answer." By the time the meeting adjourned, the sun had already dipped below the skyline. Jonathan stood alone in the empty boardroom, hands resting on the back of his chair. The city outside was alive with light thousands of small windows, each one a glimpse into someone else's story. He wondered how many of those stories were shaped by fear of judgment. How many people stayed silent to protect what wasn't worth saving. He wasn't going to be one of them. He reached for his phone and typed a short message to Emily. "Meeting's over. It was rough, but we're still standing." He didn't expect her to reply right away, but a minute later, his phone buzzed. "Standing together," she wrote. A rare smile crossed his face. For a man who had spent most of his life calculating risks, Jonathan Hale had just taken the greatest one of all, and for once, it felt like freedom. The storm outside hadn't stopped since the board meeting. Denver's skyline shimmered beneath sheets of rain. Its glass towers blurred like a watercolor, left too long in the water. Inside, Hale Financial Group. The air was thick with whispers again, this time not from gossip, but from uncertainty. 2 investors had postponed meetings. 1 client had withdrawn a major account. It was subtle, quiet, polite, but unmistakable. The company was holding its breath. Jonathan Hale felt it everywhere in the cautious emails, the stiff greetings, the empty smiles that once carried confidence. He'd faced market crashes, lawsuits, and competitors before, but nothing quite like this. This quiet erosion of trust, and all because of honesty. He spent the morning fielding calls, smoothing nerves, promising stability, but behind every conversation, he could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Is Jonathan Hale losing control? By the time the last call ended, his voice was raw. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the steady hum of rain tapping against the glass like a heartbeat. He couldn't slow. His reflection in the window looked tired older somehow. He didn't regret what he'd said in that boardroom, but he couldn't ignore the damage it was causing. And beneath that worry, deeper than pride or frustration, was guilt. Not for himself, but for Emily. On the 22nd floor, Emily Carter was feeling that same guilt like a weight across her chest. Her transfer to investor relations had gone into effect that morning. The new department was polite but distant, every smile measured, every conversation short. She could feel it in the way they watched her when she walked in. No one said anything cruel aloud, but silence can sometimes wound deeper than words. By noon, she couldn't take the stillness anymore. She grabbed her coat and left for lunch, though she wasn't hungry. Outside, the rain came down in sheets. She didn't open her umbrella. She just started walking. The streets glistened beneath her heels. Water streamed along the curbs, gliding past parked cars and newspaper boxes. Her hair clung to her cheeks. Her clothes grew heavy. But she didn't care. The cold felt honest, something she could finally feel without pretense. Her mind replayed the board meeting and fragments of rumors she'd overheard. Words like reckless and unprofessional floated through her memory. Though she hadn't been there to hear them herself, she could imagine Jonathan standing alone before the board, calm, composed, absorbing every blow. And she hated that she was the reason he'd had to. She crossed a small park, empty except for a few pigeons huddled under a bench. Her shoes splashed through puddles, each step a dull rhythm to the storm in her mind. "You should have left when you had the chance," she told herself. "You should have handed him the letter and walked away." But she hadn't. Because when he'd said, "Let's do it right," something in her had wanted to believe it was possible that love and integrity didn't have to be enemies. Now, she wasn't so sure. She found herself standing at the edge of a fountain, rain rippling across its surface. She sat on the cold stone ledge and watched her reflection break apart in the water. The city lights shimmered faintly around her. She could almost hear her father's voice again, steady. "Unwavering integrity isn't what you do when life is easy. It's what you do when it costs you something." Her throat tightened. "Well, Dad," she whispered, "it's costing both of us." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, letting the rain run down her face. She didn't know if the water on her cheeks was rain or tears anymore. Back at Hale Financial, Jonathan stood by the same window where she'd left him days before. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the view of the city. He could see his reflection ghosted over the skyline, a man who had everything except peace. His assistant, now temporary, knocked on the door. "Sir, the London investors just canceled tomorrow's call." He nodded. "Thank you." When she left, he loosened his tie, staring at the folder on his desk. Inside were projections, loss mitigation plans, and media strategies. He had a plan for everything, except her. At 7:00 p.m., Emily returned to her apartment soaked, exhausted, and hollow. She left her wet shoes by the door and dropped her bag on the floor. The silence of her apartment felt heavier than the noise of the office. She made tea she didn't drink and sat by the window. Watching headlights streak through the rain below, she imagined Jonathan still at the office, trying to hold everything together with his bare hands. He didn't deserve this fallout, not after all he'd sacrificed, to be honest. And yet, the company wasn't the only thing unraveling. Her piece was too. Maybe leaving really would fix this, she thought. Maybe stepping away would take the target off his back. But another voice whispered back softer, deeper, stubborn. Or maybe leaving now would undo everything you both fought for. She rubbed her temples and closed her eyes. The two voices wrestled inside her until the line between them blurred. The rain eased to a drizzle around 9. Emily slipped on her coat again and walked out onto her small balcony. The air was cold, fresh, and smelled faintly of pine from the trees lining the street below. She looked out at the city lights stretching toward the horizon, beautiful, distant, indifferent. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, he was probably doing the same thing looking out, wondering if love could survive the weight of reputation. For a long time, she just stood there, breathing in the quiet. Then, softly, she said it aloud, as if confessing to the wind, "I love you, Jonathan. But I don't know if that's enough." The words drifted into the night, swallowed by the hum of traffic and rain. Back at his apartment, Jonathan was on his balcony too, bourbon in hand. The phone on his table buzzed with new messages, none from her. He didn't blame her. He knew how the world could crush a person for doing the right thing in the wrong place. He whispered to himself, "If she leaves, I'll let her, but not without telling her what she means to me." The storm had finally quieted, But the damage was already done. Tomorrow, the markets would open, the board would reconvene, and the whispers would start again. But tonight, two people, miles apart, stood beneath the same sky, each wondering if love could survive the cost of courage. The rain had finally stopped. Morning sunlight spilled across the Denver skyline, turning the glass towers gold. It should have been a hopeful day, clearer skies, new beginnings, but inside Hale Financial Group, the air carried a different kind of tension. At 9:30 sharp, Jonathan Hale received a call from reception. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says you'll want to make time." He almost declined. His morning was already packed, but something in the assistant's tone made him pause. "Who is it?" There was a short hesitation. Victoria Lane. The name landed like a stone in still water. For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. Then he exhaled. "Send her up." Victoria Lane. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Once, she had been his business partner, co-founder of Hale Financial's early division, back when the company had been just a handful of employees and a rented office. Brilliant, ambitious, utterly magnetic. Victoria had a way of bending a room to her will. They had worked side by side for 4 years, pushing each other toward success, blurring lines between collaboration and something almost romantic. But when ambitions diverged, hers toward risk, his toward integrity, they had parted ways. And rumors had done what rumors always do, filled the silence. He hadn't seen her since. Until now. When the elevator doors opened, Victoria stepped out like she owned the floor, tall, poised, dressed in charcoal gray with a single diamond pin on her lapel. She was every bit the legend people remembered. "Jonathan," she said, her voice smooth as aged wine. "You look exactly the same." He smiled faintly. "You don't." "Good," she said with a smirk. "I spent a fortune making sure of that." They shook hands. Her grip was firm, her perfume subtle sandalwood and something darker. He gestured toward the seating area. "Please, have a seat. I won't take much of your time," she said, settling gracefully onto the leather chair. "I'm with Braddock Investments now. We're expanding our portfolio in sustainable infrastructure, and we'd like Hale Financial to consider a joint venture." He studied her. "Braddock. You're with Daniel Braddock for the moment," she said lightly. "Let's just say he appreciates my talent more than my modesty." Jonathan folded his hands. "Why come to me? We're competitors." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "Because we're also survivors. You built your empire from nothing. So did I. We both know loyalty doesn't exist in this industry-only leverage. And you, Jonathan, have plenty of that." He gave a faint smile. "You always did speak in chess metaphors." She returned the smile, slow and deliberate. "And you always pretended not to understand them." Unseen by either of them, Emily Carter stood in the hallway outside, holding a folder meant for Jonathan's signature. She had knocked once, gently, but the low murmur of conversation had stopped her. Through the glass wall, she could see them, two figures framed by sunlight, leaning toward each other, their expressions soft, familiar. Victoria's laughter carried faintly through the glass, warm and intimate. Jonathan's shoulders were relaxed, his smile genuine in a way Emily hadn't seen for weeks. Something inside her twisted. It wasn't jealousy born of vanity. It was the ache of watching history walk through the door and remind her she was replaceable. She lowered her gaze, clutching the folder tighter. She told herself to wait, to breathe, to be rational. But emotion doesn't wait for logic's permission. Inside the office, Jonathan was still listening carefully as Victoria outlined her proposal. "Braddock wants to acquire 3 of your smaller funds," she said, "but I convinced him to offer partnership instead. You'd retain oversight, profit, and reputation. It's a win for everyone." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Except you never offer anything without wanting something more." Her lips curved slightly. "You always did know me too well." "Then tell me," he said evenly. "What do you really want?" Victoria's gaze softened. to see if you're still the man I remember." He leaned back, careful to keep his tone neutral. And what man was that? "The one who believed in impossible things," she said. "The one who used to look at me and say we could take on the world together." He shook his head slowly. "That was a long time ago. Victoria, but not forgotten." Her eyes lingered on him. "Tell me, does she know about us?" Jonathan froze for a fraction of a second. There was no us. She smiled. "Not officially? No. But that never stopped the rumors." "Did it?" He stood, his patience thinning. "If you came here to provoke me, it's not going to work. If you came here for business, send me the details in writing." Victoria rose too, closing the distance between them just slightly. "Still the same," she murmured, "so careful, so contained. I wonder if anyone ever gets past those walls anymore." He looked at her steadily. "Someone did." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's expression flickered curiosity, then something sharper. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose I'll have to meet the woman who managed it." Out in the hallway, Emily stepped back just as the door opened. Victoria emerged, poised and radiant, carrying herself with the grace of someone who had never been told no. She stopped when she saw Emily. "You must be Emily Carter," Victoria said smoothly. "I've heard so much about you." Emily straightened, managing a polite nod. "And you are Victoria Lane," she said with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Old friend of Jonathan's." "Friend," Emily repeated quietly. Victoria's gaze lingered a moment too long. "Yes, a very good one." She brushed past, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving behind the faint scent of sandalwood and smoke. Emily turned slowly toward the open office door. Jonathan was standing by the desk, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he began. That wasn't what it looked like. She forced a calm smile. "You don't owe me an explanation. Jonathan, she's part of your world. I'm just trying to stay in mine." "Emily, please," but she was already walking away. The folder clutched to her chest like armor. That night, the city was alive again, streets wet, lights glittering. Emily sat alone in her apartment, replaying the image of Jonathan and Victoria standing together in that sunlit office. Maybe it was harmless, maybe it was business, but what she'd seen had carved out into a place she thought was finally safe. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, soft but steady. Like the echo of something coming back she thought she'd outrun. The next few days passed like a dream, half forgotten, every moment, clear at the edges but blurred in the center. Emily came to work each morning, smiled when required, completed her reports, and left on time. To anyone watching, she was the picture of composure. Inside, she was unraveling. She had told herself that seeing Jonathan with Victoria was nothing, a misunderstanding, a remnant of his past that had nothing to do with their present. But denial, she was learning, is just another way to postpone the ache. Each night, she replayed that moment, the laughter, the ease, the way Victoria had looked at him like someone who still held a claim, and each night, it cut a little deeper. By Friday afternoon, the air in the office had shifted again. Rumors had a way of mutating, like shadows changing shape with the light. Now, people whispered about Victoria's visit. "She's back to win the company," someone said, "or maybe to win him." Another added. Emily tried not to listen, but whispers have sharp edges. They find you even when you turn away. At 5:30 she was gathering her things when her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan Dinner. "Tonight we need to talk." Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before typing back, "Okay." Just one word. Not yes, not no, just enough. They met at a quiet restaurant near the edge of downtown, a place with low lights and dark wood panels, where no one from the office was likely to appear. Jonathan was already there when she arrived, sitting by the window. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said softly as she slid into the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming." She nodded. You said you wanted to talk. I did, he said, about everything. The waiter came, took their orders, disappeared. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Finally, Jonathan spoke. I should have told you about Victoria before she showed up. Emily looked down at her napkin. Why didn't you? I didn't think it mattered anymore. But it did, she said quietly. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. You're right. I underestimated how it would look. But she means nothing to me. Emily, whatever we had had ended years ago. Emily's gaze stayed on the table. She said she was an old friend. She's many things, Jonathan said carefully, but friend isn't one of them. Then what was she? The question hung in the air longer than he intended to let it. Finally, he said, complicated. The word hit her harder than any confession could have. Complicated. It was vague enough to hide 1,000 truths, and that vagueness frightened her more than clarity ever could. She looked up at him. Did you love her? Jonathan's eyes flickered. I thought I did, but what we had was ambition, not love. Did she love you? He hesitated again. She loved what we built together. Emily forced a small smile. That sounds familiar. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? She met his gaze, her voice calm but trembling at the edges. Maybe I'm just realizing that I might love you more than you can love anyone back. Jonathan froze. That's not fair. Maybe not, she said softly. But it's how I feel. The waiter returned with their drinks, breaking the tension for a brief moment. Emily thanked him, but her voice was distant, automatic. Jonathan leaned forward. Emily, don't let her come between us. What we have is real. She nodded slowly. I want to believe that. I really do. But there are things you never say, things you hold back. And I can't tell if it's because you're protecting me or protecting yourself. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I've spent my entire life guarding things, information, emotions, people. It's how I survived in business. But with you, I'm trying to unlearn that. Her voice softened. And maybe I'm asking you to unlearn too fast. They sat in silence, the candle between them flickering, casting shadows that stretched across the table like invisible barriers. Later, as they walked out into the cool evening air, the distance between them felt heavier than the cold. Downtown Denver sparkled under the streetlights, but everything looked unreal, too bright, too sharp. Jonathan reached for her hand. Emily. She hesitated before letting him take it. You have to know, he said quietly. I'm not hiding anything that matters. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean into the warmth of his hand and let it be enough. But doubt is like a slow leak. It drains faith one drop at a time. Maybe love built on secrecy can't survive the daylight, she whispered. He looked at her, startled. What does that mean? It means, she said, her voice breaking slightly, I don't know if we're strong enough to live in the open. He let go of her hand then, not in anger, but in something that felt like sorrow. The silence between them stretched, heavy and fragile. When she got home that night, Emily stood by her window, watching headlights blur down the wet streets below. Her reflection stared back at her tired eyes, drawn expression. She remembered the early days, before confessions and chaos, when everything between them had been quiet admiration and unspoken hope. Now it was all noise, questions, doubts, fear. Her heart ached for something simple, trust. But trust, she realized, wasn't a gift, it was a choice. And she didn't know if she could choose it anymore. Across town, Jonathan sat alone in his office. The city stretched before him like a map of everything he'd gained and everything he might lose. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted like nothing. He thought of Emily's voice, soft, tremulous, filled with doubt. He wanted to call her, to explain everything again, to promise transparency, to beg her to hold on. But words, he knew, had limits. Sometimes silence said what the heart couldn't. He whispered into the empty room, Please, don't stop believing in us. But she wasn't there to hear it. And outside, the wind howled against the glass, carrying with it the first hints of another storm. It was late afternoon when Victoria Lane appeared again. The office had settled into that soft end-of-day rhythm, the hum of printers, the muted ring of phones, the sigh of weary ambition. Emily was reviewing an investor brief in her new cubicle when she caught the faint reflection of movement behind her. Still working this late? The voice was warm, almost melodic. Emily turned. Victoria stood there, poised as ever, her expression a careful balance of charm and calculation. "Ms. Lane," Emily said quietly, straightening in her chair. "If you're looking for Jonathan, he's still in the boardroom." Victoria smiled, setting her leather bag on the edge of the desk. "Actually, I came to see you." Emily blinked. "Me? Yes. I thought we should talk woman to woman." The phrase landed heavily, its friendliness too rehearsed, its undertone too deliberate. Still, Emily gestured politely toward a chair. "Of course." Victoria sat, crossing one leg over the other with the grace of someone who never doubted her place in any room. "I imagine this must be difficult for you," she began. "All the attention, the gossip. You've become quite the topic of conversation downtown." Emily folded her hands on the desk. "I don't pay attention to gossip." "Of course you don't," Victoria said, smiling faintly. "But others do. And perception, dear, can be crueler than truth." Emily studied her carefully. "Is that why you're here to remind me?" Victoria tilted her head. "No. I'm here because I actually respect what you've done. It takes courage to stand beside a man like Jonathan." Emily frowned. "Beside well," Victoria said, eyes glinting, for now. The pause was deliberate, a test. Emily's voice cooled. "If you have a point, Ms. Lane, I'd appreciate you getting to it." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "You're talented, Emily, intelligent, poised. You don't belong trapped under a scandal that isn't yours to carry. Jonathan's name will survive this. He's too powerful not to. But yours." She let the words hang. "Well, the world isn't as forgiving to women." Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression steady. "I'm aware of the double standard." "Good," Victoria said, smiling again. "Then you'll understand why I'm offering you something better." She reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a crisp letterhead embossed with the logo of Braddock Investments. "We have an opening," Victoria said. "Strategic relations. You'd oversee a small team, manage client portfolios. The salary is double what you're earning here." Emily stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you offer that to me?" Victoria shrugged lightly. "Because I like hiring capable women, and because you deserve a clean start. No whispers, no pity." Emily's voice was calm, but her chest felt tight. "Or maybe because it would make things easier for you if I left." Victoria smiled, not offended, just amused. "Ah, there's that sharpness Jonathan always admired." The name sounded intimate on her tongue, like a memory wrapped in silk. Emily took a slow breath. "You're wasting your time, Ms. Lane. I'm not leaving Hale Financial." Victoria's eyes softened, but her words carried quiet precision. "You think he'll stay loyal forever. Jonathan has a pattern. Emily, he surrounds himself with brilliance until it threatens him, and then he moves on. That may have been your experience," Emily said evenly. "It's not mine." "Isn't it?" Victoria's tone lowered, almost kind. "You think you're different because he loves you?" "I used to think that too." Emily's composure cracked for the first time. "You and Jonathan, what happened between you?" Victoria's expression flickered, something human breaking through the confidence. "We built this company together. We shared the same vision, the same sleepless nights. But ambition is a jealous lover. Emily, eventually, there wasn't room for both of us. So, you left," Emily said softly. Victoria nodded. "And I learned that people don't fall out of love, they just find better ways to hide it." There it was, the wound beneath the armor, not pure malice, but a mix of hurt and pride that had hardened into manipulation. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the building's air vents, the steady rhythm of the city beyond the glass. Then Emily rose, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I appreciate the offer, but I won't be taking it." Victoria's eyes narrowed, though her smile didn't fade. "Think carefully. This is more than generosity, it's a lifeline. I don't need saving." Victoria stood too, adjusting her jacket. Everyone needs saving eventually. The question is, from what? Emily stepped closer, her tone soft but unwavering. "You're right about one thing. We're not so different. We both loved the same man. The difference is, I'm not asking him to choose." For the first time, Victoria looked momentarily disarmed. Then she recovered, offering a cool, almost respectful nod. "Perhaps that's what makes you dangerous?" She picked up her bag, turned toward the door, and paused. "If he disappoints you, and he will, you'll know where to find me." And with that, she walked away. When the door closed, Emily sank back into her chair. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through her. She opened the envelope anyway, staring at the crisp Braddock letterhead and the offer she'd refused. It was generous, tempting, safe, but it felt like surrender. She folded it carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer of her desk. For a long time, she just sat there, staring out at the fading light over Denver. Part of her felt victorious. She had stood her ground, refused to be bought or manipulated. But another part of her, quieter, more uncertain, couldn't shake the echo of Victoria's words. "Jonathan has a pattern. He'll move on." She wanted to laugh them off, to trust him completely. But doubt, once spoken aloud, doesn't fade easily. That evening, Jonathan found her in the lobby as she was leaving. He smiled, but she could tell he was weary. "You disappeared all day. Everything all right?" She forced a small nod. "Fine, just busy." He studied her face for a moment, sensing something unspoken. "Emily," he said softly, "you know you can tell me anything." She hesitated. For a heartbeat, she wanted to tell him everything that Victoria had come, that she dangled both poison and pity in one perfectly crafted offer, but pride stopped her. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "I know." He kissed her temple gently before she stepped into the rain. And as she walked toward her car, the nightlights reflecting off the wet pavement, she wondered whether strength meant holding on or learning when to let go. Monday came gray and heavy, the kind of morning where even the sky seemed uncertain. Emily sat alone in her small apartment, a resignation letter open on her kitchen table. It was shorter than the first one she had written months ago. No flowery goodbyes, no polite transitions, just truth. She had rewritten it 3 times before she stopped trying to make it sound reasonable. There was no reasonable way to walk away from love. She read the final line again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes leaving isn't about giving up. It's about letting someone keep what they've built." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter, slipped it into a plain envelope, and tucked it into her bag. She didn't plan to tell Jonathan. Not this time. She couldn't watch his face fall again, couldn't bear another argument that ended in promises neither of them could keep. The elevator ride to the 31st floor felt endless. Every familiar sound, the ping of the doors, the hum of printers, the low murmur of conversations pressed on her chest like nostalgia, turned to ache. When she reached her office, she didn't sit down. She opened her drawer, removed the Braddock Investments envelope from last week, still sealed, and stared at it one last time. Then, quietly, she tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. "I'm not leaving for her," she murmured. "I'm leaving for me." Down the hall, Jonathan was wrapping up a meeting when Patricia Miles, the operations director, stepped in with a file. "Jonathan, before you sign that, you should see this." He glanced up, distracted. "What is it?" She hesitated. "Emily Carter's resignation. Effective immediately." The words didn't make sense at first. He took the paper, scanning it once, twice. His chest tightened. Who accepted this? She left it on my desk, Patricia said quietly. Said it was final. Jonathan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. Where is she? I think she's still upstairs packing her things, but he was already out the door. The corridors blurred. He moved fast, barely noticing the startled glances of employees as he passed. When he reached her office, she was there, standing by her desk. A small box half filled with personal items, a framed photo, a coffee mug, a book with a cracked spine. Emily, he said, breathless. She froze, then slowly turned toward him. Jonathan. His voice was low, urgent. Tell me this isn't real. Her eyes flickered with sadness, not surprise. It is? He stepped closer. Why? After everything we fought through the board, the gossip, the doubts, why now? Because, she said softly, I can't be the reason your company collapses. It's not collapsing, he said sharply. It's adjusting. So are we. She shook her head. Investors are pulling out. Clients are nervous. Everyone's questioning your leadership, and they all trace it back to me. That's not your fault. It doesn't matter, she said, her voice trembling. They think it is. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Emily, we can fix this. We can weather it. We just have to hold on. She looked at him, her eyes full of quiet heartbreak. Hold on to what? To love that feels like standing in a storm, praying it won't blow everything away? He turned toward her, his voice rising despite himself. You think I haven't sacrificed? You think this hasn't cost me? That's exactly the point, she said, her tone breaking. It's cost you everything, your reputation, your investors, the company you built from nothing. I won't let it take any more. Love shouldn't cost someone everything they've built, she whispered. He stopped pacing, staring at her. The silence between them thickened until it hurt. Then he said, quietly but fiercely, if it's not worth risking everything, it's not love. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a confession all at once. Emily swallowed hard. That's easy to say when you're the one with something to lose. You think I only have the company to lose. He took a step closer, his voice rough now. Emily, I'd give up every title, every dollar, every bit of credibility just to not lose you. Tears welled in her eyes. And that's exactly why I have to go. He reached out, but she stepped back, shaking her head. You once told me, she said softly, that you built this company on principles, integrity, discipline. You can't let love be the thing that breaks those. His voice faltered. And what about your integrity? You said love was worth the risk. It was, she whispered, until it started hurting more than it healed. The silence after that felt bottomless. All the words they'd left unsaid over the months, the fears, the promises, the doubts now hung between them, fragile as glass. Finally, Jonathan spoke again, quieter now, almost pleading. Emily, if you walk out that door, it's not just your job you're leaving behind. It's us. She met his gaze. Maybe that's the only way to save what's left of us. For a long moment, they just stood there, two people who had fought the world to be together. Now, losing to themselves, Jonathan's hands fell to his sides. So, this is it. Her answer was a whisper. I think so. She picked up the box from her desk and started toward the door. When she passed him, he caught the faint scent of her perfume lavender and something he'd never been able to name, and felt the ache of every memory they'd shared. She stopped at the threshold, not turning back. You once told me love was the only thing that made all this worth it. Maybe it still is, just not like this. Then she was gone. He stood there long after she'd left, staring at the empty doorway. The rain began again outside, soft and steady against the glass. Somewhere in the city. She was probably driving away toward freedom, toward peace, toward something that didn't demand constant defense. He pressed his palm to the cold window, eyes closing. Everything inside him screamed to chase her. But, for the first time, he didn't move. Because love, he realized, wasn't just about holding on. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to stop fighting and letting the person you love find their own way back. 3 days passed. The city kept moving. Stock tickers rolled, coffee brewed, and meetings continued. But for Jonathan Hale, everything had gone still. He hadn't called her, not once. He knew if he did, she might come back out of guilt, and that wasn't love. That was rescue. So instead, he worked, or at least, he pretended to. He signed papers he didn't read, sat in meetings he didn't hear, answered questions with sentences that meant nothing. But every time he looked at the empty chair across from his desk, the one where she used to sit during late nights, her laughter softening the hard edges of his world, he felt the silence press in again. He'd built this company from scratch, brick by brick, risk by risk. But without her, it felt like holding an empire built on dust. On the fourth night, after everyone had gone home, Jonathan stayed behind. The office was dark except for the city lights filtering through the glass. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, staring at Denver's skyline, 1,000 lights blinking like small, defiant hopes. For the first time in 15 years, he asked himself what all of this was really for. The long hours, the constant control, the endless fight to stay respected. Success had given him everything except peace. He turned back toward his desk. A single candle burned there, its flame flickering gently beside a stack of papers, his resignation letter, already signed. When Patricia Miles returned to retrieve some files that evening, she froze in the doorway. "Jonathan, what on earth are you still doing here?" He looked up, smiling faintly. "Just finishing something important." She saw the letter and frowned. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said quietly. "It's time." Patricia hesitated. "You don't have to do this. Things will calm down." "The press." "This isn't about the press," he interrupted softly. "It's about doing what's right, for her, for me, for the company." He handed her a sealed envelope. "This is my formal resignation, effective in 3 months. Lucas Chen will take over as CEO." Patricia's eyes widened. "Lucas, the CFO. He's ready. He's been ready for 2 years. He'll lead well." "Jonathan," she began, then stopped. "You're sure?" He nodded once. "More than I've ever been about anything." She stood there for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered, "even if it breaks your heart." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes. That's the only way to know it's right." After she left, he walked through the quiet halls of Hale Financial Group one last time as its leader. The echoes of his footsteps sounded heavier than they should have. Every room held a memory: the first investor pitch, the late-night strategy meetings, the celebrations after big wins. But his mind wasn't on those. It was on a small apartment somewhere across town, a woman sitting by a window, maybe still awake, maybe still wondering if he'd ever understand what love meant. He was finally ready to show her that he did. An hour later, there was a soft knock at her door. Emily Carter hesitated before answering. When she opened it, Jonathan stood there, no suit jacket, tie loosened, rain clinging to his hair. "Jonathan," she whispered, startled. "I didn't know where else to go," he said quietly. Her instinct was to step back, to protect herself from the ache she still felt. But something in his expression, calm, resolute, made her stop. He took a deep breath. "I resigned today." Her heart lurched. "What I stepped down? Lucas will take over. The board knows. The staff will hear tomorrow." "Why would you do that?" she asked, voice trembling. "You built this company. It's your life." He smiled gently. "No, Emily, it was my life. Until I realized I'd rather build something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Not a ring box that screamed wealth or spectacle, just a simple, soft square that looked almost modest in his hand. "I know I've hurt you," he said softly. "I know I've been proud, careful, afraid. But you taught me something. Emily, that success means nothing if you have to face it alone." Her eyes filled with tears. Jonathan, he stepped closer, his voice steady but full of emotion. I'm not asking you to forget the chaos, or the rumors, or the mistakes I made trying to protect us. I'm asking you to start over with me, not as your boss, not as your secret, but as your equal. He opened the box. Inside was a ring simple gold, with a single small diamond, but beneath the stone, carved into the band, were two words, New Beginning. The candlelight from the hall flickered across it, soft and golden. Emily stared at the ring, then at him. You resigned for me? He shook his head. For us. Her voice trembled. Jonathan, you didn't have to. I did, he said gently. Because love shouldn't have to survive in the shadows. And if the only way to bring it into the light is to let go of everything else, then so be it. She pressed her hands to her face, tears falling freely now. I don't know what to say. He smiled softly. Say yes. For a moment, the world went silent. Just the sound of their breathing, steady and uneven, filling the space between them. Then she lowered her hands and whispered, yes. Jonathan exhaled a sound somewhere between relief and disbelief. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting there all along. They stood together for a long time, neither speaking. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the city lights shimmered through the window. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his heartbeat. Are you scared? She murmured. He smiled, terrified. So am I. Good, he said quietly. That means it's real. Later, as they stood by the window, he whispered, you once said love shouldn't cost someone everything they've built. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. And you said, if it's not worth risking everything, it's not love. He brushed a tear from her cheek. Looks like we were both right. They kissed not desperate this time, not rushed or uncertain, but slow, steady, and full of the kind of peace that comes only after choosing each other completely. In that quiet candlelight, surrounded by the hum of a sleeping city, two hearts finally found their home, not in ambition or control, but in courage, honesty, and forgiveness. The snow had begun to melt in Boulder, Colorado, and with it came a kind of peace that neither Jonathan nor Emily had known in years. The city was smaller, quieter, tucked against the foothills of the Rockies like a secret that didn't need to prove itself. Gone were the skyscrapers, the suits, the endless meetings. In their place were modest offices, mountain air, and people who spoke about innovation with the warmth of belief instead of the sharpness of ambition. It had been 6 months since Jonathan left Hale Financial. 3 since Emily had joined him at Aurora Ventures, a small renewable energy startup housed in what used to be a converted warehouse. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the floors creaked, the coffee was terrible, but it felt like home. Each morning, they arrived together just as the sun spilled over the mountains. Emily always carried a thermos of coffee, and Jonathan, out of habit, carried 2 laptops, one for work, and one that never left his bag. Just in case, he always said, smiling sheepishly. Old habits die hard. She teased him once, placing a hand over his, but that's okay. You don't have to erase who you were to become who you are. He looked at her, then really looked and realized she had changed too. There was still a quiet strength in her, but it had softened. The tension that used to sit behind her smile was gone. Here. She wasn't the woman whispered about in corporate hallways. She was simply Emily the strategist who could turn numbers into vision and uncertainty into action. Their days were long, but full of purpose. Jonathan worked on partnerships, drawing from the same discipline that had built his fortune. Emily led a small research team studying wind efficiency in rural communities. Sometimes they argued about data, budgets, priorities, but the arguments were different now. They ended in laughter, not silence. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Emily leaned against the window of their shared office, watching the sunlight ripple across the mountains. You know, she said, this place reminds me of who I wanted to be when I first started my career. Before the politics, before all the noise. Jonathan set down his pen, smiling. And who was that A believer? She said softly. Someone who thought work could make life better, not just richer. He nodded slowly. Maybe we both needed to find our way back here. Evenings were their favorite part of the day. They had rented a small house on the outskirts of town, a white bungalow with a porch that looked out toward the Flatirons. Emily filled it with warmth. Cookbooks lined the kitchen counter. Candles flickered in every room. And there was always music, soft jazz, sometimes old folk tunes that drifted through the open windows. Jonathan had discovered he loved cooking. He was terrible at it at first, too methodical, too cautious until Emily taught him to let go. Cooking isn't finance, she told him one night, laughing as he measured salt with the precision of a surgeon. It's intuition. Feel it, don't plan it. He pretended to scowl. I'm more of a quarterly results kind of chef. She handed him a spoon. Taste first. Then we'll see. The stew had been perfect. Sometimes, after dinner, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, mugs of tea in hand. The air smelled of pine and earth, the kind of clean scent you could never find in the city. Do you ever miss it? Emily asked once. The company, he replied. She nodded. He thought for a moment. Sometimes, not the pressure, but the purpose. The feeling that what I did mattered. It still does, she said softly. Just in a different way. He looked at her, smiling. You always did have the better perspective. She nudged his shoulder playfully. That's because I'm usually right. Spring came early that year. The mountains bloomed with wildflowers, and the wind carried the scent of rain and renewal. Aurora Ventures began to grow slowly, steadily, with integrity. Their projects in sustainable wind and solar solutions started gaining attention. Investors visited not to demand, but to learn. And when people asked Jonathan why he, a millionaire from Denver, had joined a small firm in Boulder, he always answered the same way. Because here, success means breathing easier. Emily liked that answer. It fit. One evening, they were working late, papers scattered across the desk, when the power flickered and went out. The room fell into darkness for a moment. Then Jonathan laughed softly. Well, he said, I guess this is poetic justice for two people in renewable energy. Emily grinned. Hold on, I've got candles. Within minutes, the office glowed with soft, golden light. Shadows danced on the brick walls, and the only sound was the quiet hum of wind outside. Jonathan looked at her across the table, her hair falling in loose waves, eyes catching the candlelight. You know, he said quietly, this reminds me of that night in Denver. She smiled, remembering the ring. He nodded, the beginning. Emily reached across the table, taking his hand. Feels like we're still at the beginning. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe that's the best part. Later, they stepped outside. The moon was high, the air cool. In the distance, the lights of Boulder shimmered softly. Small, human, alive. Jonathan slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Do you ever think about how far we've come? He asked. Every day, she said. And sometimes I still can't believe it. He smiled. I can. You were always the strongest part of the story. She looked up at him, eyes bright. No. Jonathan? They stood there for a long while, listening to the wind. It wasn't the rush of the city anymore. No deadlines, no gossip, no noise. Just the soft rhythm of a quieter life, rebuilt from the wreckage of ambition and remade in love's gentler light. The morning sunlight spilled through the wide glass windows of Braddock Investments, casting long streaks of gold across the marble floor. It was a clear spring day in downtown Denver, the kind of morning that used to fill Victoria Lane with hunger, the hunger to conquer, to win, to outshine. But today, she felt only stillness. Her office was immaculate as always, a single orchid on the table, perfectly aligned folders, a city view that once made her feel invincible. Now, it made her feel small. She sat at her desk, scanning the latest business headlines as her assistant brought in coffee. There it was, near the bottom of the screen. Under emerging ventures in clean energy, former CEO Jonathan Hale launches Aurora Ventures, a new chapter in renewable innovation. The article featured a photograph. Jonathan, standing beside Emily Carter, both smiling under the Colorado sun. No boardroom, no suits, just open sky, casual clothes, and an unmistakable ease between them. Victoria stared at the image longer than she meant to. For a moment, her throat tightened. Then, she exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. "Ma'am," her assistant said gently. Noticing her pause, "Is something wrong?" Victoria shook her head. "No, not at all." The assistant hesitated. Curious. "You know him, don't you, Jonathan Hale?" A small smile tugged at Victoria's lips. "I did. Once." The young woman glanced at the screen again. "Looks like he's doing well." Victoria nodded. "He is? Do you ever regret it?" the assistant asked quietly. "Losing him?" Victoria's gaze lingered on the photo, Jonathan's hand lightly touching Emily's back. A gesture so natural, it spoke of years of trust. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned slightly toward the window, where sunlight caught the edges of her hair. "No," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "He finally found what I never gave him, peace." Her assistant stood silent, unsure how to respond. After a moment, Victoria gestured toward the coffee. "You can leave it, thank you." When the door closed behind her, the office fell quiet again, filled only with the faint hum of the city below. Victoria took a slow sip of her coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but she didn't mind. Her eyes drifted back to the photograph. Jonathan looked different, lighter, as if he'd set down something heavy he'd been carrying for years. And Emily Victoria had underestimated her. Back when she'd visited Hale Financial, she'd seen only a woman in love, fragile and naive. But now she saw something else, calm strength, the kind that doesn't fight to win, only to heal. Victoria smiled faintly. "You were right about him," she murmured to herself. "He needed saving, just not the kind I could give." She stood and walked toward the window. Outside, Denver glittered beneath a clear blue sky. It was the same city where she had built her name, her wealth, her empire, and yet, somewhere deep down, she realized she had never truly lived here. She had survived, achieved, but she had never been still long enough to feel peace. Her reflection in the glass looked softer than she remembered, older, wiser, maybe lonelier, but not bitter. She thought of the early days with Jonathan, two hungry minds dreaming of power and permanence. They had built something extraordinary together, but it had always been made of glass, transparent, beautiful, and breakable. Emily had given him something she never could, gentleness, a safe harbor after years of storms. And for the first time, Victoria didn't envy her. She was grateful someone had done what she could not. The intercom buzzed. "Miss Lane," her assistant's voice said. "Mr. Braddock is asking if you'll be joining the meeting." Victoria smiled faintly. "Tell him I'll be there in a moment." She returned to her desk, closing the laptop softly, her fingers brushing the smooth edge as if saying goodbye to a chapter that had already ended. Before leaving, she opened the top drawer and pulled out a small photograph, one taken nearly a decade ago. She and Jonathan at the opening of Hale Financial's first office, younger, ambitious, standing side by side in the flush of early success. She studied it for a long moment, then placed it back in the drawer. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant it for him or for the memory itself. Later that afternoon, during the meeting, Victoria listened to discussions about mergers, profits, and growth. She participated, made her notes, gave her advice. But part of her mind wandered not to Jonathan, exactly, but to something his journey had awakened in her. When the meeting ended, she lingered by the conference room window. The city stretched endlessly before her, but beyond it, she could see the faint outline of the mountains distant, patient, unchanged. For the first time in years, She wondered what it might be like to stop chasing everything and simply be, maybe not today, but soon. That evening, she left the office earlier than usual. She walked instead of taking her car, letting the city unfold around her, the rhythm of footsteps, the smell of roasted coffee from street corners, the laughter of strangers. It felt unfamiliar, almost new. She passed a newsstand where the same article from the morning was displayed on a local business magazine. This time, she didn't stop to read it. Instead, she smiled, quietly, as if to herself. Then she kept walking, her heels softer against the pavement than they'd ever been. In Boulder, under the fading light of the same evening, Jonathan and Emily were sitting on their porch, sharing a bottle of wine. Emily rested her head on his shoulder as the wind rustled through the trees. Jonathan's phone buzzed once, an email notification. He glanced at it and smiled faintly. "What is it?" Emily asked. He showed her the screen. It was a short message. No greeting, no signature, just one line. "Congratulations. Jonathan, you finally got it right." Emily smiled softly. "Who's it from?" He looked out toward the mountains, the last light catching in his eyes. "An old friend," he said. The mountain air carried a faint chill that evening, the kind that brushed against the skin like a whisper, reminding you that even warmth has edges. Emily Carter and Jonathan Hale walked along a narrow trail that wound through the foothills of Boulder. The sky above them was painted in deep gold and violet, clouds streaked like brushstrokes from a patient artist. They had finished their work early at Aurora Ventures that day, the last report filed. The team already gone home. Jonathan had suggested a walk, something to clear their minds before dinner. Emily agreed, though she knew they weren't really seeking fresh air. They were seeking understanding, the kind that comes only after everything else has been said. The gravel crunched softly underfoot. Birdsong drifted from the trees, fading with the light. Jonathan carried a small backpack with water, and Emily, ever prepared, had tucked a folded map in her jacket even though the trail was familiar. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. It had been almost a year since they left Denver, a year since the storm of board meetings, resignations, and heartbreak. Now, that chaos felt distant, like an old photograph left in a drawer. They had built something new, smaller, simpler, more human, work that meant something, love that no longer needed defending. As they climbed higher, the city below grew faint, replaced by rolling hills and the shimmer of fading sunlight on snowcaps in the distance. Jonathan stopped for a moment, breathing in the mountain air. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The company," she said. He nodded. Emily smiled faintly. "Sometimes, not what it became, but what it was in the beginning. The hope, the purpose." He looked at her, thoughtful. "You know, I used to think success meant never looking back. And now," he chuckled softly, "now I think looking back is how you remember why you kept going." They reached a clearing overlooking a wide valley. The sun hung low, brushing the horizon with copper light. Jonathan spread his jacket on a flat rock, and they sat together, shoulder to shoulder. The silence between them was comfortable, full, not empty. Below, the lights of Boulder began to flicker on one by one, tiny constellations born of human hands. Emily rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about her?" He didn't have to ask who she meant. "Victoria," he said softly. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. She was a part of who I was, then ambitious, restless, certain that winning was the only way to matter." Emily smiled. "You've changed. So have you. I guess we both had to lose something to find what mattered." For a while, they simply watched the sky change gold, deepening to amber, then to rose. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Jonathan took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles over her knuckles. "Do you ever wonder what people say about us now?" She laughed softly. "Probably that we disappeared." He grinned. "Maybe that's the first good rumor." Emily turned to face him, her eyes catching the last of the light. "Do you regret any of it?" He shook his head slowly. "Not the hard parts, not the losses. Every mistake brought me here to this moment, this life, this quiet." She squeezed his hand. Then we finally learned what peace feels like. The sun began to sink behind the mountains, and the world turned honey-colored soft, forgiving. Jonathan stood and helped her to her feet. "Come on," he said gently. "We should head back before dark." They started down the path, their shadows long and intertwined against the earth. The air cooled quickly, and Emily slipped her hand into his jacket pocket, an old habit she'd picked up during their first winter together. He smiled, remembering. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to think love was something that happened when life was perfect. Now I think love is what makes life bearable when it's not." Jonathan looked at her, quiet admiration in his eyes. "You always did see things clearer than I did." "Not clearer," she said softly. "Just slower." When they reached the base of the trail, the last light of day spilled across the valley like melted gold. They stopped again, one final pause before stepping back into ordinary time. Emily turned to face him, her voice low and steady. "You know, Jonathan, we spent so much of our lives chasing things: success, approval, control. We thought we were fighting for meaning, but maybe we were just afraid of stillness." He nodded. "And now, she said, smiling faintly, "stillness feels like home." They stood there for a moment, the quiet wind weaving around them, the day exhaling its last light. Then Emily took a slow breath and said the words she'd been carrying for months, words that belonged to both of them, and to everyone who had ever tried too hard to win at life, in a world obsessed with winning. Maybe love is the only victory that matters. Jonathan smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that once made her fall in love with him in the first place. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then, I guess we finally won." She leaned into his touch, eyes closing, the warmth of his palm grounding her like sunlight. The last trace of the sun slipped beyond the ridge, leaving the world wrapped in a deep, gentle blue. As they walked back toward the trailhead, their laughter carried faintly on the wind. It wasn't loud or exuberant, just quiet, real, content. Behind them, the mountains glowed with the memory of the day, and ahead, the path curved toward twilight. Two silhouettes moved together through the fading light, not as boss and assistant, not as symbols of ambition or scandal, but simply as two souls who had finally learned the hardest and most beautiful lesson of all, that peace, when shared, is the truest form of love, and that sometimes the sunset isn't an ending, it's a promise. Sometimes life's greatest lessons don't come from success or wealth. They come from the moments we almost lose everything. Jonathan and Emily's story reminds us that love isn't about possession or pride. It's about courage, the courage to be honest, to walk away when it's right, and to stay when it truly matters. In a world that rewards ambition, they discovered something far rarer: peace. They learned that integrity and tenderness can coexist, that success means little without someone to share it with, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is surrender control. For many of us, the older we grow, the more we realize real love doesn't shout. It listens, it heals, it forgives. It finds its way not in perfection, but in the quiet, everyday choices to keep showing up for each other. Because in the end, love isn't about winning. It's about finding peace and choosing it again and again. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love and integrity still matter in this busy world, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more stories of hope, courage, and second chances. And remember, no matter your age or your past, every sunset carries the promise of a new beginning. We'll see you in the next story.